scripture this morning coming from the Gospel of Matthew, 12th chapter, beginning the very first verse. Matthew 12, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrated the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." And this is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Now, the fourth commandment instructs us to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And as I was writing this sermon, I realized I'm preaching to the choir, or at least to the congregation, because we're all here, right? We know. The ones who need to hear this message aren't here. So, every one of y'all, go find somebody, go to Walmart, go out there and get the people jogging, and bring them back here and I'll wait. Because they are the ones who need to hear this sermon. Because we're right. We're here. We're observing the Sabbath, the fourth commandment. But how do we really remember the Sabbath? How do we truly keep the Sabbath holy? Now, this is one of only two positive commandments in the Ten Commandments that says do this instead of don't do that. You know, there's a lot of don't do that. Also, it is the lengthiest of the commandments because it is commandment followed by instruction, bolstered by motivation. All the other motivations were just because I said so. You know. But this one we actually have motivation. So remember the Sabbath. We have to understand that biblical remembering is not a cognitive exercise. It actually requires action. So it means a call to activity. But for the Sabbath, the activity, the action is really restriction. Because it says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female slaves, your livestock, or even the alien resident in your town. So the instruction, the biblical remembrance, is no work. And then there's the motivation. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but God rested the seventh. So the instruction tells us work for 6 days. Obviously, this is before unions. You can work for 6 days, but on the seventh you rest. And the motivation is because that's how God did it. And so it is the commandment to establish a weekly observance, a weekly day of rest, to mark our life with a focus upon the divine. And in it, it follows this pattern of creation that is lifted up in the Bible. So it is a commitment to the God of creation through a cycle of connectedness to that creation. So remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now, how do we do that? And most of us know the answer. We come to church, right? We're here. But while Scripture repeatedly tells us that Jesus was in the synagogue on the Sabbath, that's really tradition, not instruction. That was actually established in exile long after the giving of the Ten Commandments. The Hebrew word sabbat is defined as to cease and to stop, and one scholar defines it as not primarily a day of assembly, but a day of quiet, a day of solemn. So it is a cease and desist command. And see, that's why Jesus and the disciples were always criticized for playing kind of fast and loose, with the Sabbath. Because Jesus obviously defined work differently than the religious zealots of his day. Because a faithful Jew did very little on a Sabbath, hundreds of laws. Even how far you could walk on the Sabbath. Robin, we'd have been dished last Sunday for the length that we walked on the Sabbath. So I guess maybe the question is how do you define work? And what about the benefits of work? What if you like work? What if you like cleaning the house? What if you like mowing? Now, mowing can be meditative. I used to get made fun of by my ex-in-laws because I'd be mowing and singing, and they'd say, "What are you singing?" "I'm singing hymns." Because it's just, you're out there in God's creation, you're singing. And believe me, mowing is the perfect time to sing hymns. Nobody can hear you. So what if you like work? What if you find fulfillment in it? What if it's even meditative for you? What if you do get closer to God through some mundane activity? It's a hard message for us to swallow in our modern society, to have that day of rest in a consumer society. Because we know if you shut down on Sunday, it's going to affect your profit margin. Just ask Chick-fil-A. Right? And what about the convenience of being able to get resources that we don't have? I remember, when everything was shut down on Sunday, it's hard. You need milk, you need butter, you need eggs. You're just out of luck. As one person said, the question of how to properly observe the Sabbath has baffled interpreters for centuries, because the first problem is, when is Sabbath? For the Jews, the original institution was the seventh day, the last day of the week, which is Saturday. Really, Christians, we don't celebrate the Sabbath, the last day of creation. We celebrate the Lord's Day, which is why the sermon title is not Remember the Sabbath, it's Don't Forget Sunday. This is not the Sabbath. Yesterday was the Sabbath. So we celebrate the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, Resurrection Day, Recreation Day. Because the Bible tells us on the first day of the week, the disciples gathered together to break bread, to share in the Lord's Supper, to set aside possessions, to come together as people of faith. So we kind of redefined our weekly observance, but the early church for a long time observed them both. Those early Jewish Christians, they honored the Sabbath and tried to keep it holy by not having any work on it. They recognized it as a day of rest. And then they had the Lord's Day where they gathered together for fellowship and for worship. And so rest on Sabbath and worship on the Lord's Day. But eventually Sabbath observance got merged in with the Lord's Day. So we kind of gave up on the Sabbath. So did these early Christians, did that first church neglect the commandment? Did we do away with that true Sabbath? Or did they truly define it? And in doing so, find a way to honor it? The Ten Commandments are listed in the Bible in two places. Obviously in Exodus at the foot of Mount Sinai or Horeb. And then also in the book of Deuteronomy. And then telling in the book of Deuteronomy is Moses there. It's kind of a swan song. He's giving instructions to those people who are going to go to the promised land because he can't go with them. And so he's reminding them to be faithful to God. He's calling them to covenant obedience. And he's telling them, well, if you want God to bless you, you've got to be faithful to God. If you want God to give you this land, you've got to be trusting in Him. And so part of that was Him retelling the Ten Commandments. And when He does, He makes a shocking change in this commandment, in the fourth commandment. The commandment in both places is the same, but the motivation is different. In Exodus, we're told to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy because on the seventh day God rested. But when you get to Moses' speech in Deuteronomy, it says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy because you were a slave in the land of Egypt. In Exodus, the motivation is you rest because your Creator rested. In Deuteronomy, you rest because you used to be a slave in the land of Egypt. So in Exodus, the command was to connect creation with Creator, but in Deuteronomy, it's to connect delivered with deliverer. Observe the Sabbath, not now as a connection to creation, but now as a connection to recreation, as a connection to deliverance. For your Creator is also your deliverer. You used to be a slave. Wood states that the meaning of all the laws is found in Israel's slave status, followed by God's miraculous deliverance. So all of covenant obedience is based on the fact that God delivered us. Deuteronomy later goes on to say, when your children ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of the decrees and the statutes and the ordinance the Lord our God has commanded us? You shall tell your children. The meaning of all this is we were slaves in Egypt, but God delivered us. God brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. He brought us out to bring us in. Then, that is when the Lord commanded us to observe all of these statutes. And so now the commandment is, remember, you're no longer slaves. Stop working like a slave. But also, the implications are far-reaching. See, it's not just to the individual, it's to other creatures. It's to the entire community. You are no longer slaves. Stop working like slaves, but also stop forcing others to work like slaves. The Ten Commandments, we know, are divided into focus between obligations to God and obligations to community, obligations to the divine and obligations to our neighbor. And this one alone combines them both. And to me, the repetition of the word slave in Deuteronomy brings attention to this. Your slaves are supposed to be able to honor it because you were once a slave. There's that wording that kind of connects us. And see, this is where we miss the mark. Because many a faithful Christian will be at church on Sunday and they'll be guaranteed to be at the restaurant immediately following the service. Right? Or they'll be guaranteed to go to Walmart immediately following the services. And believe me, I've been on the other side. Most restaurants don't like the church crowds. Believe me. So we'll be sure to be at church to remember and honor the Sabbath. But what about those slaves and resident aliens? Now, how much good would it be if I took the day off, but I went home and I said, Kimberly, you need to mow the grass and mop the kitchen and fix me a sandwich while you're at it. We kind of missed the mark, not to mention how that would impact my marriage. So the point is, the Sabbath commandment is not primarily as it's defined, a cultic ordinance. It's not just a religious thing, but in its intent and character, it is humanitarian as well as theological. They're not just instructions for behavior, but they give us an insight to the heart and the mind of God and the purpose of being creation. And the point is, the Sabbath is a gift. Jesus would later go on to say, Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. And obviously it's not meant to be a restrictive thing, not to be a burden, but to be a delight. So don't leave here saying, well, Pastor Mike said if we go out to eat lunch after church, we're all going to hell. Or don't leave here saying, Pastor Mike said if we go to Walmart after church, we're all going to hell. Pastor Mike didn't say that. Moses did. But show me how you define work, and I will show you how you define the Sabbath. I mean, we might not be able to agree on what constitutes work for each and every one of us. You know, Jesus and the religious leaders couldn't in that day and time. But we do know what constitutes work for others. And believe me, I like the convenience of a 24/7 society, you know. But I also think we've lost something as a society, as a nation. We're called to rest to celebrate our deliverance. We are called to rest to show our connection to creation. But it's not just a call for us to rest, but for us to help others to rest as well. And in that we've lost our sense of the holy, which means set aside or set apart. And if Sunday or Saturday is just like any other day, is it holy? Is it set apart? And really, are we okay with the fact that a chicken restaurant and a hobby store give more testimony to their commitment to God than we do? Are they a greater witness than we are? So, we may have an employer who forces us to work on Sunday. We might find pleasure in working ourselves on Sunday. We may make decisions to be the reason that other people have to work on Sunday. The question is, in the rush of our lives, can we make it whole? In regards to all this going on, can we make it whole? Well, really, the Sabbath is a sanctification of time. And Maximus the Confessor said that any union with God is a Sabbath. Anytime you can just put the brakes on. Anytime you can sit there and just marvel at the wonders of creation. Be thankful for the joy of your deliverance. That is a Sabbath. Now maybe life calls us to where we can't have an entire day, 6 hours or 12 hours or 4 hours or maybe even one. But we can have many Sabbaths. Sabbath observance, however it is, it gives us a theological perspective on life. It connects us to our Creator and it allows us to show that we truly trust in God to provide for our needs and to continue to deliver us. So God has given us life. And God, through Christ, has given us new life. And because of that, God requires a responsive life. Now, not all of it. Just a portion. Just a tiny bit. Sometime during the week that we can recognize God in our midst. Jesus said, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. If the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, and Jesus is the Lord of our life, then Sabbath should have some kind of meaning to us as well. Let's turn to our hymn of invitation. And ask that you stand with me and join in singing 277. Christians, we have met.